Hi, this is Zoe, and we have a bigwig on the call today. His name is Ron Carucci. He is the best-selling author of 8 books, high achiever here, and a popular contributor to Harvard Business Review and Forbes. I see his articles get quoted all the time, and for good reason, because they're awesome. So one of the fascinating things about Ron is that he led a 10-year longitudinal study of executive transition to find out why more than 50% of executives fail within their first 18 months on the job. And through the research, he discovered some amazing stuff, which we're going to talk about today, about how you can be successful rather than fail at your job as an executive. And he put it all in a fabulous book called Rising to Power, which he co-authored with Eric Hansen. He's a TEDx talker. He's a consultant and coach and strategist with organizations from startups to Fortune 500s. He's been showcased everywhere in 25 countries and 4 continents. And I am thrilled to have you here. So welcome, Ron.
Zoe, thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so tell us your origin story. I always like to know how you ended up starting before turning into such an international bigwig on the leadership circuit.
Gosh, I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I think since I was a little kid, I was always fascinated by the organization of human endeavor, people coming together to try and do things that they couldn't do on their own. If there was a fundraiser for our school, I wanted to organize it. If there was a stickball game in the neighborhood to put together, I wanted to get everybody together to play. I just somehow have always been drawn to what it means to bring people together and to work on things that were important. I don't know that I knew that was my fascination. I just was always drawn to it. I think, where I switched to move to the organizational behavior field, I began my career in the arts, quite a distance from the field I'm in. I was in my early 20s working in Europe, and we were in, of all places, the chapel at Dachau. And I don't know that they had the term diversity and inclusion or such back then, but if that had been a term, that's what this would have been about. It was a program on differences. And we had people in the room from the military, the State Department, the government, civilians, Germans, Americans. The Iron Curtain was still up, but there were beginning conversations with East Germany. And we were talking about how do we deal with people who are different than us. And during the conversation, a young American military soldier raised his hand and he said, very vulnerably and rather exasperated, I'm just so tired of being trained to hate. And I think I, along with my colleagues, were quite moved that he was so willing to say that. In the back of my head, I'm thinking, how did something we do up here on this platform make him think that? And I think I was shocked. And so after that, we had a little bit of a group conversation about it. And afterwards, I wanted to know more. So, it's Munich, you go out for beer. So we went out and I heard more of his story. He wasn't much older than me at the time. But I think if I look back at my career story, that moment, I think, began a long pivot of understanding that telling great stories is interesting. It's a great, interesting, fascinating way to earn a living. But entering other people's stories and helping them write their stories better and helping them make differences of their own stories, that was going to be fascinating for me. I think the artistic endeavors for me I bored easily. But recognizing that, wow, everybody's story is different. Every organization's story is different. It's never going to be boring. I think that began for me the draw toward this work.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. So just curious now about this young fellow you met who was in the military. What did you discover in terms of what happened to him next? Like, did he get over being taught to hate, or what was the story there?
I think, gosh, I wish we'd stayed in touch. I think he was conflicted about joining the military. I think he, at the time, communists were evil and we were good. And remember when we did our preparation for that program, we walked up the East German border, and you could see over layers of barbed wire into East Germany. And I remember going, "Whoa, I'm looking at real communistic people." Like it was a zoo. And I remember asking one of the guards on the wall, what's it like he goes, at night we open the gates, we go out and play soccer with them. We share cigarettes. Yeah, it was like it's not that big a deal. They're human. I'm like, wow. So I think he was trying to discover his own humanity at the same time, except that that's something we all have in common, right? The difference is maybe he was seeing weren't as stark as he may have been led to believe they were. And I hope he went on to, find that in his life. I know he certainly helped me discover that, the work of telling stories only matters when people incorporate it into their own story.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And that incorporating into your own story needs self-reflection, and it needs processing and so on, as opposed to just living through life and experiencing it.
Yeah. And it often needs help. I think we need other people to do it. I don't think it's something we can do on our own.
Yeah, you're right, because we can be swimming in our own story and not being aware that it is a story. It just seems to be reality.
Yep.
Which I think is probably an interesting segue into this whole notion of power that you explore in one of your books, Rising to Power, and how one of the pitfalls or cliff edges, if you like, of getting into an executive role is the seduction of power. And that once you're in that role, because with executive powers is authority over other people, and we can fall into traps with that. Things like abdicating, even accommodating. So like the reverse of power in some ways, like deferring power, as well as manipulation, so on. So in your work, what did you discover is the best way to avoid these?
Well, I think preparation is always the best antidote. I think, we expected to find all the overindulgences of power and abuses of power that the tabloids love to report, for immoral and self-interest. But what was fascinating to us is that those in fact were not the greatest abuse of power. The greatest abuse of power was abandonment, was people letting go and not using it, which I think we have to come to believe as equally as much an abuse and as harmful as self-interest.
Can you just explain that again? So what was the word that you just said? You skipped over it. The danger, the biggest abuse of power was what?
The abandonment of it.
Abandoning power.
Yeah, the forfeiting of it. There were more people inclined to not use their power than misuse it. And it actually caused just as much damage to organizations and communities as the self-interest story is juicy and we love to read about it because it's scandalous. But the reality is there are far more leaders disinclined to use their power at all, and they paralyze organizations. They fragment organizations. They accommodate organizations. They cause dilution of performance. They introduce mediocrity by trying to get people to like them, by buying popularity, by colluding. And most leaders are so afraid, whether it's of making a mistake or of causing other people to feel bad or disappointing people. And that's your job as a leader, right? So part of being able to use power responsibly is to recognize that when you fail to use it at all, you're forfeiting a greater good. The unique thing about leaders in positions of broad influence is that they have the opportunity to bring to organizations a sense of justice, a sense of meritocracy, a sense of self-discovery, a sense of changing of your minds and broadening perspectives. The sources of power we looked at were positional power, relational power, and information power, because those are typically the biggest sources leaders have available to them. And when you use them well, the sweeping change you can effect from a unique perch is powerful. And if you're not willing to embrace the greater good that you can influence that way, and with that comes the need to sometimes disappoint people, because you have to say no. You have to narrow the focus of people, and sometimes that means disappointing them. Executive leadership is the ability to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb. And if you're trying to be popular and make them like you and dole out way too many yeses, you're just going to fragment and dilute the ability for the community to have impact. And so the best way to get comfortable with that is to start early. Every successive role you have may come with increasing degrees of that kind of power. Learn to use it well. Prepare yourself for where you might be uncomfortable. Prepare for yourself for where you might get triggered, or be tempted to put it down and not use it, so that you can figure out why, and prepare yourself for those pinnacle roles where you have the broadest degree of influence you could possibly have, and set your sights on how you use it well. Set your sights on the organizational good you can do, because you're in that role.
So I think one of the biggest challenges in doing that, so it's one thing to prepare for it and to look at, use it for good, not evil, etc. The base instinct to belong is one of the hurdles I find with new executives, is that they leave behind their peer group and they have not yet integrated into the new peer group, which is the other executives. And is this sense of mourning and loss that people go through, and it's sort of where do you find your belonging? So can you speak to that a little bit? What's your experience with helping executives navigate that transition?
Well, I do think that the ability to the alien next door phenomenon, I call it, right? People all of a sudden realize that their relationship set has changed. People who were their peers are now direct reports. People who were their bosses are now their peers. People who were direct reports are gone. And they fail to reorient the relationships. The political dynamics are changed. There is that sense of people who used to love me as a peer now distrust me as a boss. They think I have an agenda. They think I'm one of them now. And that's all it's going to happen, right? So there's in the book we talk about how do you recontract? How do you literally sit down with each of those relationships and talk about how does this relationship have to change? What are the boundary conditions now? What can we talk about? What can't we talk about? What parts of if we have a past relationship, what parts can we preserve? What's out of bounds out of work? What's out of bounds at work? And actually contract for that, and not just assume it all works itself out. Because what many executives get unexpectedly caught off guard by is when the old guard comes and says, "Oh, now you're in this job, you can do something for me." Or so this is how it's going to be now, huh? Or when the new peer set tries to haze you and test you, and bait you with, "Are you going to be one of my allies now, or can I get?" So before we go into the meeting, I just wanted to run this decision by you and make sure I had your support. Right. So all of those political dynamics that now often are operative at senior levels, you have got to make some values decisions about how you're going to play, and you cannot make those decisions in the moment. You actually have to make the decision about how you're going to handle those things before you get there. And if you wait to the moment where someone's eyes are on you, baiting you, tempting you, pressuring you, manipulating you, and that sense of isolation you talk about kicks in, where I could intensify this isolation right now, or I could be in. What am I going to do? And that short-term indulgence can have a long-term cost if you're not careful.
Yeah, it's dangerous territory, and it speaks actually to one of the 4 things that you talk about in your book as the key skills that new executives need to get a handle. Well, probably all executives need to get a handle on, and that's the first one is context. So understanding trends and forces at play in the organization. So you've spoken a little bit about the internal politics. How do you recommend that executives go about understanding their organization better to get a sense of the breadth of responsibilities and dynamics there?
Well, so breadth was one of the 4 patterns of success that we found in the populations, the executives that actually were sticking the landing, the ones that weren't failing. And one of the challenges of growing up in an organization, especially if you've risen through successive levels of, is that if you came up through a function, for example, if you came up through marketing or through finance or through sales, you typically have a shaped set of biases you're not aware of. So if you come up through marketing, you see the world through brands or consumers. If you come up through sales, you see the world through revenue. If you come up through finance, you see the world economically. And the problem is when you get to the top of an organization or near the top of an organization, it's no longer about that world. Right now, your job is to coalesce all the pieces together, is to harmonize the fragments and create a greater whole out of the parts. So, where you may have used to seeing the world through supply chain, now you have to see the world through go-to-market. That includes supply chain, marketing, sales, and logistics, right? All those capabilities come together across functional boundaries. And typically when you grow up in a sort of a silo, if you will, you're used to the border wars. That's just a normal part of organizational life. Now you have to solve the border wars. And you have to create the pathways across the borders and get people to work well, or you wind up being a very hub and spoke leader where you're the referee to all the conflicts and the rivalries. And the best executives have breadth where they now go from playing first chair to conductor. They know how to make all the pieces sound right together. They know how to create pathways across these borders without them having to be the one that does it. And they harmonize the organization. They know how to build bridges instead of further divide the organization. When they keep those biases and tend to overly emphasize economics or finance or brands or whatever their past prepared them for, they imbalance the organization, and they actually generate more politics and more individualistic behavior than they actually want.
I think that's a really important thing to point out, and because we can get so attached to as executives running our own little teams, and because we have control over that, and then when we get put into positions of executive power where we have to negotiate and see the bigger picture, we lose that sense of control and family likeness. Well, we think we do anyway. We think we lose control of that sense of family, but what we do engage is just a broader family, and that the whole organization is a family, not just your little pocket of sales or your little pocket of operations and so on. And that's actually quite a difficult thing to get your head around, actually, because you do lose a sense of control and autonomy when you get into those parts where you're dealing with your peers who have vested interests as well. So instead of the next thing that you talk about, one of the things you talk about in your book, which I think is probably, for me, was one of the most powerful things, is understanding context. And context is what's happening outside of the organization. And I do a lot of work with leaders on this as well, is understanding the big question of what the hell is going on out there. And because we're so swamped in information and we're bombarded with messages all over the place, what in your experience is the best way to get a handle on context? Like, how do we figure out what the trends and patterns are and the systems at play outside of an organization?
Well, it's great. And first, acknowledging that you need to is usually a big step, right? Because most leaders get so consumed in a very insular way, they can't even read the context inside, right? There's a cultural context happening around you in the organization, and there's the broader context on which that organization sits. But the great news about being barraged with information is that you can have somebody sift it for you, right? There are industry trends, there are competitor trends, there are ways to keep alert. But as long as you know that your job is no longer, your time horizon has to change, right? You're not thinking about next week or next month, you're thinking about next year. And so if you notice your time horizons are still measured in days and weeks and months, you're playing too low. And as a result, you're probably creating compression. You're probably flattening the organization's ability to operate. I tell, whenever I work with executive teams, I tell them there shouldn't be anything on your meeting agendas sooner than 6 months. If you're coming together and talking about stuff that's happening next week, you're hurting or you're doing harm to the organization, because that means someone else is not talking about those things who should be. And so you got to orient your time horizons. You got to orient yourself to ambiguity, because so much of what you're dealing with has less certain outcomes to it because it takes longer to affect.
Can we just talk about that for a second, that sort of orientation to ambiguity? Because I think that's a pretty critical piece there. Yep. So when you work with leaders around that, how do you help them orient to ambiguity? What are the key insights around that?
So I think a couple of things. One is you brought up the point before, about my need for control. If I have excessive needs for immediacy and control and tangibility in my outcomes, I'm going to struggle. Right. So how do you help begin to reorient what defines achievement, what defines impact? So many middle managers struggle to let go of the middle management work they're comfortable with when they get to the higher levels, under the guise of, well, I'm going to let go of it gradually because they're not ready to take it yet. We've all heard that excuse. But the reality is, I'm not ready to take hold of a rein that has a much longer lead on it. Mm. And so how do you begin to define impact for them and actually help them understand that the value you create for the organization is not what it used to be? In fact, if you continue to create value the way you used to, you're actually going to erode value. Which is counterintuitive for many of them, because they've been so rewarded for their results orientation. They've been so rewarded for the things that have gotten them to the top. And some of those very capabilities that propelled them there could actually cause them to implode there and derail if they're not careful. So redefining how they exert control, redefining how they define achievement, and what defines satisfaction for them, and redefining what their role is to their direct reports. So typically, they're used to being the answer ATM, right? Someone comes with a question, they get out the answer. And how do you learn to be the question ATM? How do you learn to ask a better question? So when people come to you with a question, how do you help them become more self-sufficient and not rely on you for the answer by offering them a better question and send them away to go find it and to learn. Most leaders get they shift their orientation for achievement by being the smartest kid in the class, and so they have answers. The problem is they don't realize that by having all the answers, they're making other people dumber because they're impairing their ability to learn. And so now I don't have to learn. I just go ask you the question, you give me the answer, I go do it. And they don't realize that they're diluting the collective intelligence of their people by being the only one that has to have the answers.
Okay, thank you for that. That was awesome. So back to understanding context. So first thing was realizing that we need to expand our time horizon and start looking beyond at least 6 months to a year or further into the horizon. What other things do you do with leaders to help them understand context?
Well, I think it's the innate issue is curiosity. What is it you're wondering about? When a competitor does something differently, when there's a disruption headed in your technology. I make all my executives subscribe. I say, go find 3 to 5 futurists that are intelligent in your industry and subscribe to them and read them. I also think that getting them oriented in so philosophy is becoming this interesting new phenomenon in business. We borrowed from behavioral science, we borrowed from aerospace for innovation, we borrowed from every other science in management science. Now we're borrowing from philosophy. So go read Descartes, go read Kierkegaard, but find some other, read novels, but find some other source of information to rack your brain with. Just so that when you're looking outside your organization and you're keeping your center of gravity rooted to a future and to external realities, you know what questions to ask. You're curious about it. It's not just oh crap, they're doing that, we got to respond. So it's not just impetus and response. It's actually I wonder why that's happening. And teach your organization to ask, to be curious, to wonder, to be fascinated by things. That's what makes great contextual intelligence. It's the anthropological nature of wonder why that's happening. And teaching people to be anthropological and how they examine what's happening and not give into the false immediacy of, oh my gosh, we better respond. But actually stepping back and pausing and thinking and being intentional about actions you take.
Okay, that's awesome. And I love that you recommend that people read novels. It's so good. Sci-fi is actually probably an excellent way too. I've had another leader recommend that. Sci-fi is always a predictor of the future. And a lot of futurists read or write science fiction. Okay, so moving to skill capacity. Number 3, about choice. And I think being able to make effective decisions is so important, and actually speaks to one of the challenges he's talked at the beginning of not wielding power, and a corollary to that is not making decisions very well. So do you have a particular way that you teach or show leaders how to make decisions? Do you have a framework, or what's your recommendation around that?
We have a couple of things. First of all, I think knowing what type of decision maker you are. Is your predisposition to over-include? Are you more solo-oriented? Are you data-oriented? Are you instinct-oriented? So there's a variety of mechanisms that feed decision making. Are you risk-averse? And so knowing your own predispositions is an important place to start. But recognizing that not all decisions are created equal, right? The degree of data, the degree of other people's voices, the degree of time, the degree of complexity, the degree of risk, the degree of instinct, it's a different mix for every choice. And knowing and telling your team, in this decision, I'm making it with your input. In this decision, you're making it with my input. In this decision, we're all making it. In this decision, I'm making it and announcing it. In this decision, I don't want anything to do with it, you make it. And so orienting yourself so people know, because so often if you watch an executive team meeting and there's a decision on the agenda and nobody knows what role they're playing. Some of them show up to be advisors, some of them show up to be, I'm making the call, some of them show up to be silent. And the CEO has not made it clear, here's the way we're going to construct this choice. And so you either hear the classic painful deferring it to, let's get more data, or let's take this one offline, or whatever the avoidant mechanism is, because they don't want to deal with conflict, they don't want to deal with trade-offs. And so beneath that iceberg of decision construct is knowing, do you know how to say no, right? Do you recognize that every decision you make is full of trade-offs at the enterprise level, especially? Every yes you dole out has dollars and time and capacity attached to it. Where are you taking it from? And so many leaders who don't realize they're leading out loud, they're making declarations. I remember working with a very large global food company once. CEO was that he processed out loud, and we're in an executive team meeting, and this team is in, that sometimes you have the dancing bears phenomenon where people just come in and present to the senior team to be seen. And this team is in presenting this very expensive initiative and study they've done on recommendations, whatever, and they're beautiful slides and lots of data. And the CEO looks at me and says, "Do you know what they're talking about?" I said, I don't know. So he finally decides to stop and go, "Sorry, why are we hearing this?" And they're like, "Because you asked for it." He's like, "What?" They said, "Well, 6 months ago we were in here presenting to you, and you said, 'I wonder what would happen if.'" And he said, "You thought that meant you should go do all this work?" He said, "Well, didn't it?" He was just thinking out loud, wondering, and they took the question to be an assignment and went off and spent millions of dollars on research and work and studies because he wondered. And so, he didn't realize he wasn't intending to make a decision. He didn't realize he actually made one, much less spawned an initiative. So we forget as executives that our life plays out on the Jumbotron, right? Our life, there's no small talk. There's no cue. We can't raise our eyebrow without people attaching meaning to it. We walk down the hall fast, something's wrong. If we're late for a meeting, something's happening. People attach meaning to everything you do and say. And so when it comes to decision making, you've got to be hyper intentional. And that's when you have to lead out loud to say, "I'm not making a decision. I'm not asking you to go do anything. I'm just wondering out loud." And be very thoughtful about the fact that people in the room are looking for cues on how you make choices, how to decode you, what time of day to come into your office and ask for something. We've seen all kinds of archetypes. There's the waffler, the one who just changes his mind every 2 minutes. There's the last one in phenomenon where whoever's the last one in the office gets their way. These are weak decision makers. But you have to know that your choice-making apparatus is on display for public view, and then people will decode it and try and exploit it. And so you've got to know what degree of data, what degree of intuition, what degree of past experience, what degree of other people's voices, for what degree of risk and in what time frame, construct the choices you have to make. And to teach people how you're going to do it and how you're going to change the mix depending on what the decision is.
That's beautiful and brilliant. And I was laughing because of the image of the executive walking quickly down the hall. They probably just need a cue card is, "I'm walking fast because I'm going to the toilet."
I waited too long to go. That's it.
Yeah, you're right. So everything that a leader does is through a megaphone. And we totally forget that. As a facilitator on some of the experiential programs I run, it's the same. All the participants, because part of the program is a period of problem solving, and you have all the answers and they don't. So they look at you to see if you're going to give them feedback with an eyebrow raised, as you said. And so I was like, forget reading my face. Often I'm just hungry. They still try it anyway.
For sure.
Yeah.
We are meaning-seeking machines as human beings, and we just want to make meaning when it's not there. And what's so sad is that we miss the meaning that is right in front of us.
Which is we just make stuff up all the time. Which is an interesting lead into the fourth pillar, or the fourth attribute or skill or capacity around connection. And you talk about building trust-based relationships. Now, trust, in my opinion, is always a byproduct of things that you do as opposed to something you pursue in itself. I'm curious about what your perspective is on building trust-based relationships.
I think I tell clients, I treat trust like it's an economy. It's a currency, right? Yeah. So some people trade trust. They extend or withhold trust based on competence. They extend or withhold trust based on actions and words matching. They extend or withhold trust based on a personality trait or how similar or different you are from me. They extend it withhold based on competence or how good you are at what you do. There's a variety of devices through which people will choose to extend or withhold trust. And if you don't know what currency you're trading in, you will, by default, extend or withhold trust or try and earn other people's trust based on the apparatus you have. Well, they could be screening you through a very different set of lenses and choose to withhold trust from you for no particular reason other than you didn't match the criteria. So you've got to have honest conversations about what degree of trust you're trying to trade in and in what way, especially at senior levels of organizations. I think trust is a commensurate of complexity. So in our relationship, what's the degree of risk and the degree of complexity of the work we have to do together? And that determines the degree of trust we need. If we have a very transactional relationship, then trust becomes less of an issue. If there's a tremendous degree of complexity and uncertainty and risk in the work we have to combine together, then trust is a bigger requirement. I also talk about the fact that I think the absence of trust and the presence of distrust are different things, right? It may be that we don't distrust each other, but we don't have a sufficient degree of trust for what we have to do together. Distrust is when I have now intentionally withdrawn it. I've now decided you are not worthy of trust. So it's no longer we don't have enough of it. I now decide you're not getting it. And that's a very difficult thing to repair. And unless you want to work at it and talk about why it was withdrawn and what happened to withdraw it, you see these tense rivalries, and you just feel these tensions among people where you've had unaddressed distrust go on for too long. It's got fungus on it now. And so we've done diagnostics where in interviews, people have said to me, I haven't talked to her in 20 years. And I'm like, do you know why? And they're proud of it. They're proud of these Hatfield and McCoy rivalries that have gone on. And you see the whole department has had this rift because these two executives don't get along. So people don't realize that there's a huge price tag an organization pays for your conflicts, because it's like a family. When mom and dad are fighting, the kids fight. And so if there's an unresolved tension or a border war between two leaders, we could assume that the whole set of people beneath you are going to play out that rivalry in similar ways, making coordination and linkage and collaboration very difficult.
20 years.
People, it's crazy the kind of grudges people can hold for no particular reason at all. And why would you brag about it? You should be ashamed of yourself. But I think that the interesting thing that set these leaders apart in the study, Zoe, was that one of the very unique things on which they gained their trust was the degree to which they sought the success of others. In other words, they prioritized their networks. They prioritized how they spent their time and with whom based on who they could help be more successful, who they could invest in, whether it was bosses or peers or direct reports. These are the people every company has, right? They're the ones that everybody wants to work for. They're the ones everybody regards highly and trusts greatly and sees as competent and inspiring. You just want to be around them. But typically, one of the greatest distinctions of their leadership is the degree to which they invest in other people's success, not looking to see what they can get from others, but what they can contribute.
Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, what a great discovery. That's uplifting. It kind of correlates to Adam Grant's research he did in his book, Give and Take. Yeah. Yep. And that the most successful people are those who give and who are also ambitious for themselves, ambitious for others and ambitious for self. So curious now, leaders can sometimes make big mistakes, huge ones. And here in Australia, there's been a number of in the Royal Banking Commission, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but there's been big scandals in the banking sector here. And AMP in particular has lost their chair and their CEO because of this decision they made to charge clients for services they didn't deliver, as an example. So the chair is gone, CEO is gone. Do you think it's possible that executives can recover from scandals like that, or is that it? Career done, over?
So we have Wells Fargo here in the United States, right? I think it's difficult. Now the one mistake that the Wells Fargo CEO made was acting as if he was the victim. 5,000 people woke up one morning and said, "Hey, I have an idea." It had been going on for years. Yeah. So I think it's you're going to need to lie low for a long time if you're the head of that, because you're either guilty because you were stupid, or you're guilty because you're complicit, right? You can't. That's the cruelty of those roles. You don't get to be innocent.
Yeah.
And you are responsible. And so your best offense is a humble defense, which is to say, I'm responsible. Character flaws are difficult to recover from. The worst thing leaders do is they actually then try and go and exploit that character flaw with, 3 years later they're on a book tour. What I learned from my integrity breach, and they're trying to they turn their flaw into a platform. That's fine. There are some people here in the United States who've done it very well, and actually in a helpful way. One of my favorite interviews was with a guy named who was a convicted felon from a bribery scandal. He's now out doing consulting for ethics in departments and how to help people avoid those scandals. Brilliant man and a good man. He's a good man. The thing that I've in all my ethics work and my research on a number of pieces I've written about in that realm, because I work, so I'm on the advisory board of ethical systems at NYU John Height's organization, and so I work with them a lot. And one of the interesting things, I interviewed a former U.S. attorney who prosecutes those criminals. And one of the fascinating things she said was, I walk into these interrogation rooms ready to meet the most vile, horrible, deplorable people. And she said, that's not who I met at all. I met really good people who I could have had coffee with that morning. And they're so good people who made a really dumb choice, right? So I think that there is grace and there is opportunity for redemption. I think it depends on how you decide to come through it and how you decide to navigate it. I do think leaders, if they choose to recover well and learn and take responsibility, they can eventually they may not be a CEO again, but they can find meaningful ways to contribute in the world and earn a living and be trusted again. It's not easy, but it can be done. But for the most part, a lot of people committing those horrible acts aren't people who set out to be malicious, self-interested, scandalous, conniving thieves. Some of them are that. There are narcissists and they're absolute sheep in wolf's clothing or wolf in sheep's clothing. But many of them are not. Many of them just lost their way. It became I'm sure those 5,000 people who that CEO so nobly fired from Wells Fargo all thought, well, everybody else is doing it, and so I guess it's okay. She knows we're doing it, so I guess this is what it is. Now, does that excuse it? No, but it does explain it. So I think, listen, the best thing to do is avoid it. Yeah. In some of our research, so the same data that we used for this 10-year study, it's now a 15-year database with 3,300 interviews in it. We just went back and studied it again. We isolated, instead of for leadership, we isolated for honesty. We isolated for what are the factors that produce or deter honesty in organizations. And there are systemic factors. These are not always issues of individual character. There are actually common systemic realities that provoke lying.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me about those.
Well, so we'll sneak preview because the ink is still wet on the research. But so I'll give you one example is strategic clarity. When organizations lack strategic clarity, people make stuff up. In other words, when we are not who we say we are, or when we belie who we say we are, or when I don't feel a personal connection to who we say we are, I'm going to embellish. I'm going to lie. I'm going to make reasons up to be here. And we see it all the time in, quarterly review meetings. People are, reporting on future strategy opportunities. They're embellishing opportunities. Oh, this one's going to be a blockbuster. And usually the roots are, we don't know what swim lane we're in here. Another one was collaboration, cross-departmental rivalry. So, where there are fragmented organizations, you have fragmented truth, right? So you have dueling fact bases. So people have to duel their truths and embellish them to prevail. So it's been a fascinating thing to discover that truth is relative because we build organizations to make it relative. When recovering from a scandal, one of the best things to do is recognize that the seeds of those scandals are sown much earlier than you think. They're not, no one wakes up one day and says, hey, let's bribe people to make money. Or no CEO or chair of a banking thing woke up one morning and said, hey, you know what? Let's charge people for stuff they're not getting. That's not how it starts at all.
Yeah.
one example of a case study I talk about in one of my Forbes pieces on this topic was large global consumer products company, very successful, very big brands. One particular year, they're doing their annual operating planning. This is a company that's heavily marketing driven, right? So that's gets all the resources. That's the sexy department. The supply chain and manufacturing footprint were, the also rans. And one year they decided it was they really could accelerate their production capacity. They had to invest in the manufacturing footprint and upgrade it and detail it. So they made the decision to invest a huge amount of tens of millions of dollars in modernizing their manufacturing footprint. Some of that money came away from marketing and the brands. At the same time, in the same annual operating plan, the sales department, the sales group, decided to divide the territories, which now intensifies the quotas, right? So those look like three relatively disparate decisions. Well, I'm sure they look innocent. Unless you ask the question, what's going to happen 2 years from now when we've doubled our capacity to manufacture things, de-invested in selling the product, and made people fighting over how they sell? Suddenly now, when the company 2 years later is indicted for channel stuffing, nobody should be surprised. But nobody looked 2 years earlier and go, oh, this wasn't just some bad salesperson's decision to stuff the channel. This happened 2 years ago when we made those decisions to reallocate resources. And the seeds for that were sown then.
Yeah.
And so organizational contradictions, when you have irreconcilable, every organization is nothing but a series of tensions, right? They're all natural tensions in every organization. But when they become contradictions that people feel like they can't reconcile, and they suddenly decide that that contradiction is not fair, the minute someone says it's not fair, the seed is sown for unethical behavior.
Yeah, right.
And that typically happens long before the unethical behavior appears.
That's fascinating. So is this becoming a new book or a new article, this ethical research?
Well, some of them are already published in articles. I've got a number of articles on this topic, and the examples that I just mentioned are already published. The research, so I'm thinking, and there's a part of me that wonders if, I do want to publish it somehow. So I'm waiting for the research groups to get the ink dry and get the statistics right and get me the multipliers of, but the reality is if you have so we found 4 recurring conditions that if you had all 4 of them present, you have like 8 times more likelihood of creating liars in your organizations. Wow. Now the question is, how do you make people care? Right? How do you decide it's important enough to change some of the conditions that may be purveying dishonesty or the truth withholding that you might not realize? Because many organizations are, they're just taking the ethical flu shot once a year where you sign the policy and, take the Boy Scout pledge. I promise I won't do anything unethical. And go on the next year, sign the policy and go on. And you're just you're just rolling the dice and betting, then you're sending salespeople out to the front lines of third world countries where bribery is normal. You're still putting people in harm's way when it comes to those temptations. So you have to wonder, how do you get people to care about the ethical fabric of the organization, not just to avoid front page scandals, but because you're probably likely going to underperform against people who actually do care.
I think potentially it's because people become acclimatized to that way of doing things. And so it's kind of like somebody who drinks every day. They get used to drinking every day. And so it's normal.
You just become immune.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a pretty tough question and maybe a good question to end the interview on. Because I think that's an important leadership challenge for all of us is like, how do we cultivate the best part of ourselves as leaders where we do care about that? Because all of us have that within us. And so bringing our best to the fore is one of our key responsibilities. Ron, thank you so much. This has been amazing. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I could spend a lot more time talking with you. And I really appreciate your time and your wisdom and your experience.
Zoe, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah.